next week. And remember, some of the things we talked about. Look, I've got written down right here some of the questions from the lecture about sales and where we are. Remember about cold calls. Remember about things like accruals and co-op advertising. Remember about call reluctance. It makes it hard to call. It's what causes the most problems with salespeople. Remember about asking for the order. Remember about a marketing standpoint of sales. Remember that radio is the most dependent on local advertising when of all the media we've talked about. Remember how salesmen get paid on commissions and sometimes a draw against commission. Remember the difference between avails and inventory. Know what a make good is. Know how cable companies do advertising through interconnects and other ways. So all those things. Remember those things. We're making a great push on test 3 to have great scores with no curves. So I want to show you a video today. We're going to talk about news today. And a lot of times when people think about news, news maybe more now than any time that I can remember is being assailed by people, and you're hearing terms like fake news. And the article that we are writing our assignment 3 on really talks about how that adds to the perception of fake news. And I would normally tell people, hey, there are things like fake news out there, but places like New York Times, AP, other places, those traditional news outlets are not fake news. They might get things wrong, but they're not fake news. But then we see, like in that story yesterday, that sometimes editorials get in the way, sometimes people's opinions get in the way. And right, people are human, and that's how they write things or they present things. That doesn't do us any favors. Like I remember I talk about a lot that I used to have, I still have some buddies that I went golfing with one Saturday morning. This is a couple years ago, and one of them said, "Hey, can't believe that Obama is doing away with the Pledge of Allegiance." And I was like, "What?" He goes, "Oh yeah, he's making the Pledge of Allegiance illegal and banning it." And fortunately, I had something like this, and so I just went to the table, looked it up, and again, it was clearly a fake news story. And I told him, "Hey, it's made up." Because I saw it on Facebook, believed it because he saw it on Facebook. So it's good for us to recognize sometimes there are things, have trusted news sources and go like that. But if you want to be in news, you want to be trusted and you want to make things happen the right way. One of the things I want to show you, I love showing this video. It's to start the class, and it's about a guy who was like you. He was a college student. He was at Ball State University. This was so many years ago. That he had his chance to be a news anchor, sports anchor. So let's watch a little of the video, and then we'll tell you his story after that, because there's more to the story. But it's a great example of how things work.
Hello, everyone. Well, the Ball State softball team continued to play this weekend, and they were hoping to continue off their straight 3 out of 4 losses. And so we'll take a look and see how that happened. They started off good, but then eventually, the Ball State women's team shut down and ended up doing poorly. Oh no. And okay, we're going to continue on now. The Ladies Cardinals will play an Iowa tournament starting this Friday. Before the Ball State baseball team kicks off its conference season this weekend, the Cards will battle in-state rival Indiana tomorrow. Tomorrow's game will be the meeting between the two, beating both first.
Say something.
Hoosiers are on the 4 on the year, and they have won 6 of its last 7 games. Tomorrow will be the game 3 at 3 p.m. Switching to Ball State men's tennis, it seems every week they have a player. Matt Lawrence is the latest Cardinals tennis player to win the award. Lamar won all the singles and doubles matches last week. So far, the Cardinals have had a player honored on the weekly awards. 7 out of the 9 weeks. The Cards will play at Boise State Invite this weekend. The Indiana Pacers are looking for a measure of revenge tonight against the New Jersey Nets and to strengthen their playoff hopes. The Nets won the last Sunday's matchup 94-85, which left the Pacers one game behind the Chicago in the 7th series spot. Let's check out the highlights. Steven Jackson's David. Reggie Miller's looking good. He shoots a three, and it's good. Later, he gets the rebound, passes it to the man, shoots it, and boom goes the dynamite. The final scores ended up with the Pacers 63 to the Nets 61. The Associated Press of the All-American first team in college baseball was announced today at Utah's 7-foot sophomore center Andrew Bogut was the leading vote receiving 60 first-place votes. Bogut, who is an Australian native, received very little attention in the preseason, but averaged 20 points and 12 rebounds a game for Utah. The four other players joining Bogut on the AP team are senior forward Wayne Summers of Kansas, and Hakan Warwick of Syracuse. Junior guard J.J. Redick of Duke and sophomore guard Chris Paul of Wake Forest rebounded out the list. Let's check out some of the scores tonight.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot for that look in sports, Brian.
Yeah.
And when we come back, we'll have one final look at weather. Stay tuned.
And that's as awful. That's as bad as it gets. That's the worst, basically, that I've ever seen. Now, there's a couple lessons we learned. Actually, a lot of lessons. One, it's harder than it looks. So remember that. That's something I want you to take from that. It's harder than it looks. You see guys doing the news. It's harder than it looks. And sometimes things go on behind the scenes that we aren't seeing there. His teleprompter went out. He had technical difficulties that you couldn't see. And the thing is, the viewer doesn't know that. They just know he looks like an idiot, right? He just stopped talking. You know, one of the things I used to do sports on television, and one of the things that benefited me was I was on the radio also. And so I was able to rely on my radio ability to just talk if something happened and something went wrong. Just talk. And there's a lot of time there that when you're watching that, you're probably thinking the volume had gone down, right? But no, he just was sitting there quietly. The story behind that is he wasn't really a sports guy. They called him an accident. He wanted to do it, and then all those things happened to him. And it was a newscast that went out over the air. It was really before the YouTube days, but it still lives on 15 years later through YouTube. The guy really has benefited in one way. He came up with "Boom Goes the Dynamite," which people still use today. People remember him. He went on to work at a TV station in Waco, and now I think he's like an independent consultant helping people edit videos and do those things. So he recovered from it. But the lessons are, remember, the lesson we learned yesterday, failure is never fatal. He moved on. He's a butt of some jokes, but really at the end of the day, who really cares, right? Nobody dropped a heart. Nobody died. But remember that. It's harder than it looks. And I think that's a guy that would really tell that story. So, but as we look at news and the change of news and how things are going, I wanted to show you two things. One is, I wanted to see this website, which is one I started. It's called RedRaidersports.com. Started it 15 years ago or so. And now it's where it is now, and 5,000 subscribers and things. And we really put in a lot of things that no one knew about at the time, that weren't thinking about at the time, like video and online video and doing things. And people were like, who are these guys? Who do they think they are? At the time when we started it, the site had 19 subscribers to now, again, it's got 5,000 plus subscribers. I had to divest myself of it a couple years ago when I came to work at Texas Tech, but it's still successful and still doing some of the same things we did back then. But so you go ahead, and I wanted to show you the site where we see Fox Sports cutting writing jobs to increase their video content. And so, again, as you look at news and where news is and what people are consuming on Twitter, and we see that Instagram is going now to this IGTV format on their app. Video is where it's at. And the thing is, you always want to be able to write. You always want to be able to tell your story. But that's why you're going towards multimedia journalists called MMJ, people that can shoot, they can edit, they can write, and they do those things. So the more you can do those things, if you want to work in news, it makes yourself valuable. So tomorrow we're going to look at some Pew Research about what people are watching and how people are consuming their news. Today we want to just look a little bit again, just the structure of some news. And again, this is part of this class and what people are looking at as far as news and news management and how news operates. One of the things I'll tell you is that it's just a different world, right, with news than it was, especially like when I was in college, there would be a certain number of jobs you could get. You come out of college and you say, okay, if I want to work in news, I'll probably go to a small market and start and work my way up. Well, again, the internet is the great equalizer. We talked about that you don't really have to be in Dallas or New York or Chicago to be what's considered successful. Now you can do almost anything and do it in your own place and still maybe get as much visibility. So that brings us to our first point, is that the reason that people, when I say people, businesses, whether it be a website, whether it be a radio station, whether it be a newspaper, do news, it gives you visibility. It gives you sometimes some credibility. And so news is something that people are going to turn to you at certain times and look. Society has become increasingly dependent on the electronic media for news and information. So think about yourself and where do you go, and when something happens and there's a big news event, you go online now, right? Look for it. When I was your age, we turned the television on. When my father's age was our age, they went to the radio. They'd wait for the newspaper the next day to read about it. But now society is changing. Electronic media has become very important because you can do things like watch television and then, but also be checking for real-time updates on your phone and on your tablet and those things. And again, news gives your operation whatever visibility, and there's so many ways you consume it now. And again, remember what we talked about radio. Sometimes if it's something locally happening, you'll go to your radio station because, again, there's a sense of community and there's a sense of tying people together. So for most people, electronic media, some form of electronic media, is their primary source for knowledge about national and international events. And really, it makes a lot of sense, right? Where else are you going to get it? The only way you're going to find out about something happening is watching it or seeing it or hearing about it. So news is obviously a key product of the electronic media. And for some places, it's the main product. Now you have cable channels and you have websites and you have others that don't delve in the news at all. But for a lot of entities, it is a key product of what they're doing. One of the things that's kind of scary, nearly half of Americans get their news from Facebook. And we'll see that in some of our Pew Research tomorrow. But it's kind of scary, right, when you think about some of the fake accounts that get set up and some of the things that people write about there, but that's where people get it. 2 of 10 adults still get their news from print newspapers, which is pretty interesting still, right? I still get a newspaper. I get it in my front yard. I pick it up. I read it, but partially because of my job. But that's going to happen less and less and less. And again, if you guys were in class, we would talk about the Daily Toreador, which used to be called the University Daily. When I was in school, everybody was reading the University Daily. So you'd come and wait for class to start, and they'd be sitting there with the University Daily. Today, nobody's reading the Daily Toreador. If there's 5,000 editions of the Daily Toreador in the bin starting the day, there's going to be 5,000 at the end of the day. It's just not where your generation is getting your news. Sorry to Andrew. I think Andrew might be working on the Daily Toreador. So getting good experience, but people are reading it online. News is important to media organizations for a lot of reasons. It's historical. News has been a part of broadcasting really since the beginning of broadcasting. And then from a cultural perspective, again, people want to know what's going on. It helps kind of define the values and beliefs and news stories you see of what's happening, what's right, what's wrong. Those things you get from news. So news is still actually very, very important. And again, it's important from a historical perspective, right? We've always done news and we've always made money in news. And there are things that you find out, and the culture is defined a little bit about what you see on the news. There's several ways you can look at news. Again, somewhat like local radio. There's a little localism to that. That the only way you're going to find out what's happening in Lubbock, Texas. We just had an election a couple months ago about the Coliseum. And really the only place you're going to find out about it is on local news, whether it be the actual television or radio or their websites or whatever. So there's a local flair to that. And then it's programming. And when you look at, let's take Channel 11 in Lubbock, Texas, for example. They have a morning show, they have a noon show, they have a 4 news, they have a 5 news, they have a 6 news, and they have a 10 news. It's programming, and it's something that they can use throughout, and it becomes an economical form of programming, right? You can do a local show without putting a tremendous amount of money into it. How a news department is organized, again, it varies by the type of media we're talking about, the type of facility we're talking about, the type of market we're talking about. And again, some stations or outlets really care a lot about news, and some don't care as much. And based on that, you determine the size of the news department. Generally, there is a news director in charge of all the local news, and that person is in charge of how you're going to cover the news, what you're going to look at, how you're going to look at it, who you're going to interview, those type of things. And then that person's also in charge of evaluating the employees. Just some titles that we look at, and this is some in radio, some in television, some on a web basis type deal. There's generally an assistant news director who helps kind of organize things and structures of how things are going to look. Sometimes, especially in television, there's an assignments editor, especially in newspaper, also an assignments editor. So you come to work and you meet with the assignments editor, and the assignment editor says, you do this, you do this, you do this. You'll hear things if you go into any newsroom, newspaper, radio, television. There's always a police scanner going on because you're listening to what's happening locally and what the police are up to. You've got newspapers in there because it's a good place to get leads for stories and things. So generally, a lot of stations have an assignment editor. There's always, for the most part, especially in bigger stations, an operations manager who's really in charge of if you have a helicopter, if you have a live truck, all those things, and somebody has to coordinate all the technical part of that. There was a station in Lubbock that years ago decided to work with a local farmer and sublease their helicopter. They thought, hey, we'll be the only station in town doing traffic coverage. It didn't last very long, right? Because there's generally not a lot of traffic coverage in Lubbock. Then you have executive producers who really write and work on what goes on in the air. You have producers who are the first line of putting that together. And then you have the anchors. We also call them by another word. They are called talent. And talent means, they're the ones that are on the air. And the reporters are also talent. And they're usually the highest paid position. They're usually, besides salespeople, in the newsroom, the highest paid people. And they're visible. And they're the visible parts of your operation. So we all know the anchors of a different station and what they do and how they represent your station. Lower level, you have reporters, and that's what, if you go out and you want to work in news, you start as a reporter. Talked about that, photographers and editors. Those are all becoming more one position now. If you want to be in sports, there's a sports, most places have a sports department. Local television news, this is a test question. Local television news, sports is the least important part of a newscast. And that's why it's tacked on to the end. And for the most part, if you have time to get to it, you might get to it. Weather, especially in Lubbock, is the most important. People are interested in the weather. You got farmers and farming, and it's very important, the weather. That's why almost every station in town leads with the weather. They might do a quick news hit, and then they'll go to the weather. Sports, it's at the end, and sports is just not as important anymore. Again, who's waiting for the 10:25 to see if Tech won the game that night, or the Cowboys, or the Rangers? No one. You're looking on your phones, you're looking where else. So remember that. Sports, least important. Weather, most important and local. It's a very important thing. Again, sports used to be a huge deal on the local markets. And if you look at Channel 11 in Lubbock, again, using them as an example, they've done a very good job of covering high schools and youth sports because they realize, hey, Texas Tech is covering their own stuff and everybody else is going after Texas Tech. We can find our niche. We can cover high schools. We can cover Little League and those things. And so you can make sports more important by doing it that way. So the news director, we talked about that person's job. They maintain the budget, and they have a regular you have two budgets: regular expense, which is your talent and running your operation, and then you have a capital expenditure budget, which is equipment, vehicles. Hey, we need new editors, we need new news cars, whatever. Just like any business, there's the cost of doing your business, and then you have funds set aside for capital expenditures, and you're using that for facilities and other things that you need. So it is difficult to budget. News is difficult to budget because there's changes. So if you're budgeting for the news in Lubbock and Texas Tech goes to the College World Series, well, it's hard to budget for that, right? You don't know if they're going to go. You think they're going to go, but you don't know for a fact. And then when they do go, all right, you got to send people. You got to pay hotel rooms. You got to pay travel. You got to pay meals and those things. And so if there's a hurricane, all of a sudden you want to send your people to a hurricane or cover a hurricane, or there's something going on in Austin that you're a Texas station. So it's hard sometimes to budget because you don't know what's happening. The most expensive area, which is personnel. And because, again, in news, you've got talent and you've got the people, the anchors that generally make the most money. So they take up a lot of your budget. So remember that the news, the personnel is the biggest chunk of the budget. Just a few issues we'll talk about news management. And tomorrow we're going to talk about some events, some defining events in news. And then we're going to talk about the Pew Research. But local news directors in radio and television and newspapers deal with this all the time. There's an erosion of the news audience. There's not as many people watching your show because overall audiences have declined because they're finding other ways to consume media. So there's less of a news audience than there was 5 years ago, 10 years ago. There's something called convergence, which is newsrooms are working with, you see this on cable all the time. You'll see a news reporter, a typical print reporter now being seen on cable or talking on the radio or whatever, because we're trying to be able to take multiple platforms and put them together. Again, MMJ. Remember, I don't have that on there, but remember that. MMJ, multimedia journalist. You can do all kinds of different things, and that's part of convergence, bringing everything together. Again, you have to deal with talent, news talent. Generally, the camera people, the other kind of studio people, it's not that big of an issue. But if you get somebody really good, people are watching that person. People are used to watching that person. And then they either going to go or you're going to negotiate with them to keep them. And so you're always having to work on contracts. Some contracts, some places, if you have an anchor, you darn well better put them on contract, because if they're very good, they need to be on contract. Because if they're not, they can leave at any time. And then you can put a no compete in there, which says you must remain off the air in the market for a certain number of time. When I left my job as a sports anchor to come work for Texas Tech, I had an agreement that I could not be on any local station as an employee for 2 years. And so it's just part of the negotiations. They all deal with ratings and sweeps, which is the periods of the year where their audience is measured. And generally, for the most part, they're held in February, May, July, November. This is television. Again, we talked about this. Radio is measured twice a year. Television is measured 4 times a year. And there's some bigger ones in those. February is a pretty big one. November is a pretty big one. And so they always have to deal with that. And sometimes you'll see them do kind of crazy stunts and things around that time to get more viewers. And then all the time, we talked about this in the ethical part of it. Hidden cameras, presenting news fairly and accurately. Sometimes a company will put out a news release. They'll say a video news release saying, hey, you don't have to cover my story. We're going to send you this and you can use this. And there's an ethical issue about it. Are we presenting both sides of the issue by using the company's video news release? So you have to have those things. We talked a lot about ethics, and that paper we're writing right now really deals with, is it ethical the way we're covering a story or how we're showing it on our news or how we're putting it in our print publication, whatever. And those are ethical issues that the reporter has to deal with, that the management has to deal with. Those are just issues that come up. A couple other things, race and ethnicity issues. You want to make sure you're presenting a balanced look to your audience. And then in some states, you don't, in Texas, you have to deal with unions. And sometimes in those union states, you can't even pick up a piece of trash. That's a union job. So that becomes a hassle a little bit to the news management. We're going to talk tomorrow. I'm going to leave that for the next one, changes in news coverage. But I just want you to remember, again, some of the things that we talked about today about being a multi-purpose journalist, knowing that in television how it's changed. News, sports is not as important anymore. Weather is important. Just the change in what's happening. Just remember those things as we look at news. And again, tomorrow we're going to give you some numbers about who's watching news, how people are consuming their news, and I think those are interesting things to look at and be something and participation all throughout this summer.